Hi, my name is Anthony Figueroa. I'm co-PI with Kay Marchbanks and Jamelia Blake on this project that I'm going to be talking about with you is immigration and school threat, exploring the significance of the border. I want to acknowledge my co-authors on this paper also, Janice Iwama, John Eason, and Shen Jiang. So first I want to talk about is why focus on safety within schools. One of the many things that we know about in relationship to school safety is that schools are a foundation of education, institution of socialization, but also a mechanism of social stratification and reproduction. And especially when we think about school safety in relationship to the children of immigrants and immigrant youth, it is a site of Americanization. Within schools, however, it's important to talk about the violence, injustice, and inequities that are evident within schools. For this project, but also just generally speaking, the ways that we think about school safety as well as violence is pretty broad and inclusive. Traditionally, we think about crime that occurs within schools and the victims of crimes that occurs within schools. But within the last 30 years or so, there's been a much broader idea of how we think about safety and violence within schools occurring here in the United States. So it's not only just crime per se, but it's also misbehavior, bullying, discrimination, inequitable treatment, harassment, sexual harassment. And now with recent years, the intersection of the juvenile justice system and the educational system, there's been a growing presence of law enforcement, but also a growing presence of juvenile justice systems occurring within US schools. Why it's important to understand is the social, psychological, educational, economic consequences in terms of why is it that we need to address school violence that's occurring within schools, but also ensure the safety of all youth within schools. There's a significant amount of understanding as well as evidence to recognize that what happens within schools can have long-term implications for the development of the child and the student, depending on which phase of the educational system that they're in. But the implications are pretty significant in terms of dropping out of school, not pursuing higher education, not being able to compete on the labor market, but also collateral consequences towards relationships and mental health and well-being. One of the things that our team often tries to stress is also how do we think about school safety and violence as a mechanism of reproduction? In other words, how do we think not all schools, but also not all students are experiencing the same type of violence, but also not the same type of social control and security precautions and safety mechanisms that are being utilized within schools. Different students experience different aspects of this, and that's one of the many things that we try to explore with our work. One of the things that we focus on this project is going to be looking at racial and ethnic inequality within schools, especially in regards to school safety and violence. But this is not simply something that we need to be thinking about today. This is something that has been occurring over the lifespan or the history of the United States. Here's an image of Ruby Bridges. One of the things that we come to recognize when we think about the threat of crime and safety, we often think about the idea of who do we need to protect children from? And in this particular instance, this is with desegregation, we're protecting Ruby Bridges from the community, right? The people who were against desegregation and wanted to have segregation continued in the school system and saw Ruby Bridges as a threat to their safety and their children's safety within the school, but also the counter narrative to that is the community was clearly a threat to Ruby Bridges that's pictured here in terms of her own safety and the harassment and the violence she had to endure just to go to school. That lens or that way of understanding school safety has changed over the years, where the gaze of security and surveillance focusing within schools and not necessarily out of schools has really brought to attention the idea of criminalization within schools. This is a concern because the racial ethnic disparities associated with law enforcement arrests and the increased contact with the juvenile justice system occurs more frequently within predominantly schools with high racial ethnic minority students attending, which has led to an increased number of arrests, which can then also lead to an increased number of likelihood of being waived over through the juvenile justice system for misbehavior and acts that are occurring within schools. To that end, there's been also a social scrutiny and public scrutiny, and as well as a policy scrutiny of thinking about schools as a step in the criminalization process, and how we need to be rethinking what is the point of schools, and we need to be more aware of what are the different ways in which schools, with the policy with school safety policies, as well as ensuring the safety of students, have implication towards the criminal justice system and the juvenile justice system for especially kids of racial and ethnic minority youth and kids of color. So this is building in conceptually the idea of threat in schools under this umbrella of theoretical umbrella. The idea is that the growing amount of racial ethnic minorities within a context or within a community, in this case within society, there's going to be a response with criminal justice and juvenile justice mechanisms that are trying to control the population, in other words, through social control measures of police, incarceration, so on and so forth. This has been evident within schools, and there's a lot of researchers that have talked about this, how with increasing number of racial and ethnic minorities within a school, there's also an increasing proportion of security, school resource officers, rates of discipline and punishment, and juvenile arrests that occur within those schools at the same time. So when we think about this with the immigrant population, many of the things that have been out there that's been discussed in the research is this hypothesis of there being a positive relationship with immigration and increasing rate of crime. The reasons behind that have been suggested that with immigrants comes criminality. However, there's been also a counter narrative and counter evidence and a much more overwhelming number of research studies that find that it's the opposite story, meaning that with an increase of immigrants and an increasing number of the immigrant population, there is a lower rate of crime that is evident within those communities and contexts. Some of those arguments have been associated with that immigrants that decide to come over are more likely to pursue employment and also have a more commitment towards in pursuing employment success, educational success for their children, which also results in a tighter family cohesion. There are a number of ways of thinking about this idea of assimilation and the assimilation process when it comes to this relationship between immigration and crime. The concept of straight line assimilation suggests that as immigrants come into the host country, in this case, the United States, the more likely they're going to be assimilating the acceptable behaviors and acceptable norms when it comes to learning English, but also following the laws and school rules. with the suggestion and with the assumption that immigrants are coming here with criminality as well as misbehavior, not knowing the norms and cultures of the host society, let's say in the United States. But there's also another suggestion, another way of thinking about these things, that immigrants, again, are coming here highly motivated, highly aspirational, committed to following the rules, trying to pursue educational success and economic success. However, but the resistance and the inequities and the barriers and the hurdles that they face within US society are having detrimental consequences towards pursuing those goals, especially for immigrants of color. What we wanted to do in this particular study that we started investigating is how do we think about these relationships in regards to the border and schools along the border. Again, there's a popular narrative in thinking about how contexts and communities along the border are more dangerous, have higher levels of crime, even though there's evidence to suggest and research evidence to suggest that's not necessarily the case when it comes to community crime. There's still a lot of unknown, and that's what we wanted to explore and wonder how do we think about that in terms of school safety and school violence. So here are our research questions. First, is there variability in the likelihood of school punishment and juvenile justice referral rates near the Texas-Mexico border in comparison to other schools? Second, how much variability exists when in controlling for known factors associated with the likelihood of punishment and juvenile justice referrals in schools near the Texas-Mexico border in comparison to other Texas schools, meaning non-border schools? And third, does the proportion of children immigrants within a school moderate the likelihood of school punishment and juvenile justice referrals in schools near the Texas-Mexico border in comparison to non-border Texas schools? So in our project, what you see here is what we tried to pursue is drawing upon the Texas Education Agency data, looking at all the schools within Texas and all the students within that school to try to answer these questions. So here are some of the descriptive analysis, and what we wanted to highlight, what I would like to highlight first is the rates. Initially, what you think about in terms of rates of punishment and juvenile justice referrals are similar, right, when it comes to the border and non-border on face value. However, once you start looking at the demographics of border and non-border schools, this is quite different in terms of the number of first generation and second generation students that are attending border schools are quite higher, which you see in these descriptive statistics. So in our first analysis, what we wanted to try to assess, and again here in this table too, is with the dependent outcome being school discipline rate. What you see in model 1 is just looking at the control variables at this moment, which just focusing on race and ethnicity. And what you'll see in that first model is the increasing number of Latinos within a school have lower rates of suspension, and the same for other racial and ethnic minorities. As they increase in schools, they also have lower rates of attention, discipline, I'm sorry. But for African Americans and Black students, the increasing population is associated with increased discipline rates. So when we start controlling for immigration, first generation immigrants and second generation immigrants, the relationship between that we saw in model 1, now that in model 2 has explained away, meaning controlling for immigration, the negative relationship between increasing number of Latino students, Latinx students, and the declining discipline rate. It is specifically within the idea of with thinking about first generation and the border specifically, when we start thinking about in this model, what we think about in terms of the relationship between increasing proportion of immigrant students lowers the likelihood of discipline within that school. And those patterns remain significant and similar to when we think about what you'll see in this model when it comes to the juvenile justice referral rate. So in other words, when we think about the relationship between growing immigrant population within a school, it lowers discipline and it also lowers referral rates, which suggests the idea of students are less likely to misbehave, immigrant students, and less likely to get punished than other students. And what you'll also see in these analyses is that the same can be said the same cannot be said, I'm sorry, for immigrant kids who are, or the children of immigrants in non-border schools. That these findings suggest that the patterns and the rates of the children of immigrants on non-border schools are higher than compared to other students. So let's go back to our research questions. And what does this suggest? First, is there variability in the likelihood of school punishment and juvenile justice referral rates near the Texas-Mexico border in comparison to other schools? The answer is yes, meaning once you start controlling for these referral rates as well, even in the descriptives, they seem similar. Once you start controlling for these other factors, there are clear distinctions. Second, how much variability exists when it's controlling for these other factors? Again, that's a yes when we start thinking about these two contexts in the different schools, meaning border and non-border schools, are very different when we start thinking about demographics, but also when we think about punishment and juvenile justice rates, they're very distinct. Third, does the proportion of children immigrants within a school moderate the likelihood of punishment? Again, the answer is yes. But they're in different contexts have different results, meaning that within border schools, the children of immigrants are less likely to get punished. That is third generation US born, native born, US born students that are more likely to be disciplined, more likely to be referred to juvenile justice. That is not the same, that story is not consistent in border schools, meaning the protections that the children of immigrants have along the border are not the same in border schools, meaning that they're starting to experience disproportionate punishment in comparison to other students. So what are the implications? So in essence, what we need to highlight is the idea of this immigrant criminal, as well as contexts in schools and along the border are dangerous. It's not accurate, right? Like these things are not representing what the evidence suggests in terms of the children and immigrants are less likely, and immigrant youth are less likely to engage in criminality, but also as a reflection of that, they are also less likely to be disciplined as well as referred to the juvenile justice system. The idea of downward assimilation is better represented or more evident in non-border schools, which suggests that even though that the children of immigrants, and specifically first generation immigrant students, are attending school and less likely to engage in this behavior, they are receiving disproportionate punishment and referral to the juvenile justice system. So these consequences that we talked about at the beginning of the presentation, in terms of the collateral consequences, that the negative consequences of disproportionate school discipline and school punishment can have for you, are evident, which can have serious implications towards this idea of assimilating in this idea of downward assimilation, that we are derailing the educational and economic success and progress of the children of immigrants because of discriminatory treatment. The other thing that we need to be thinking about with future research is also how do we think about studying and addressing the inequities of the children of immigrants within the United States educational system. Meaning that the growing number of the children of immigrants within US schools are rapidly increasing. And we need to be, meaning we as a society need to be thinking about equitable treatment of this population as we move forward. The other thing that we need to be thinking about, or at least researching more deeply, is the idea of more stringent and social control policies within schools. Should there be alternatives other than school punishment and references to juvenile justice system? That we need to be thinking other aspects that are alternatives to that rather than just punishment. One of my colleagues, Aaron Kupchak, often talks about in his research the idea of wrong lessons that increased security and school safety measures can have within a school. He coined the term and the current discipline regime, that how punishment has become very normative within schools, and how we need to be thinking about a different type of narrative and different type of way of ensuring school safety, aside from punishment practices and increasing social control. Because it has serious implication, and it has detrimental educational lessons, as often you would even know, in terms of these wrong lessons that we're teaching students within these schools, but specifically and especially students of color and children of immigrants when it comes to disproportionate punishment. Victor Rios also talks about the hypercriminalization and the youth control complex, meaning that the surveillance and the control that we impose upon youth of color, but also children of immigrants, is something that can have serious implications, not only for the children, but also us as a society, as we continue to think about an increasing proportion of youth that are racial and ethnic minorities. But if we're punishing them and derailing their educational progress and success, this has serious implications towards the labor force within the United States. So when we start thinking about limitations with this research and future research questions, oftentimes I think about these as simultaneous or overlapping. We need to start thinking about the connection between immigration and school crime along the border, but also in relationship across the United States beyond just Texas. One of the things that we have clearly come across in terms of thinking about the Latinx population is how does that intersect with the indigenous population, especially along the border, where many of the Latinx population identify as indigenous because there are multiple generations within what was priorly known as Mexico, especially along these states along the Mexico-US border. One of the things that we often need to question deeper is the idea of socioeconomic status and how that intersects with race, ethnicity, and immigration when it comes to disproportionate punishment, but also educational inequities within the school. We need some of the questions like, what is the role of how is it that society and the cultural understanding of the border being a dangerous place and immigrants are criminals, or the association or high correlation which is a myth, that immigrants are criminals. Where's that coming from? And we need to be more critical about the origins of that kind of false narrative in our society and disrupt that with research evidence. We need more research to be looking at the relationship between school safety and community and family influences, especially for the children of immigrants and racial and ethnic minority youth. And finally, we need to be thinking more about and researching more about these federal, state, and county policies. Well, not only when we think about school safety, but also immigration policy. Because clearly what's happening on the ground, or let's say what our study has revealed, is that these narratives of immigrant youth as criminal or misbehaving or deviant is not evident. It's not reflected in the research. However, this narrative and policies are being implemented based on that assumption. So we need to be, meaning us as researchers, but also us as society, need to be more thoughtful about how we have these connections between narratives and policy in terms of how we need to be better pursuing evidence-based research to inform policy around school safety. So thanks for your attention, and take care.